Hi, this is Matt Baker. About a year ago, we posted a video called 37 Bible Characters Found Through Archaeology. In that video, I emphasized the fact that all 37 of those people, indicated here with a verification checkmark, lived during the Iron Age or later. This is because the Bible is basically an Iron Age book, meaning that it was during the Iron Age that the Bible started to be written. To put it another way, by the time the biblical authors put ink to parchment, the Bronze Age was already a distant memory, and therefore they had to rely on a lot of guesswork, mixed with imagination, to come up with stories from earlier times. Which is why Genesis and Exodus read more like myth and legend than, say, 2 Kings, which includes a lot of historical details that nicely line up with what we know from other sources. Now, while critical scholars are all basically in agreement about all of this, there are still some people from certain religious circles who continue to believe that the Bible is 100% literal history. These people sometimes cite certain archaeological finds as evidence for biblical characters from the Bronze Age. Therefore, in today's video, I'm going to take a look at some of these claims, and I'm going to do so with the help of Religion for Breakfast, Tablets and Temples, Dig It with Raven, Al-Muqaddimah, and Digital Hammurabi. But before we jump into it, I want to tell you about a shortcast that I've been listening to on Blinkist. A shortcast is simply a short podcast, and Blinkist has lots of them. As you might know, Blinkist is a website and app that provides you with the main ideas of over 6,500 books, which you can either read or listen to, usually in less than 30 minutes, and sometimes in even less than 15. I often check out a book on Blinkist before making a decision on whether or not I want to purchase and read the whole book. Well, Blinkist also has shortcasts, such as Dan Snow's History Hit. I recently listened to this episode entitled Archaeology, Discoveries and Historical Biases. In fact, it helped me in preparing this video, and I think you'd like it too. So if you'd like to get a 7-day free trial and 40% off Blinkist Annual Premium, just click the link in the description or pinned comment. Or you can scan the QR code on screen right now. All right, back to the Bronze Age. Let's begin by taking a closer look at where the division between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age occurs on our biblical family tree chart. Basically, the dividing line would look something like this. So, characters such as the 3 patriarchs, as well as Moses, all belong in the Bronze Age, whereas characters like Deborah, Ruth, David, and Samuel belong in the early Iron Age. As mentioned in our previous video, the earliest Israelite leader for whom we have a contemporary extra-biblical source for is Omri. We do have an earlier mention of David outside of the Bible, but it's not actually from a contemporary source, as it only mentions him as being the ancestor of a later king. So if we want a contemporary source, then no, we don't actually have anything for David. However, when it comes to non-Israelites mentioned by name in the Bible, we do have someone even earlier than Omri, and that is Shawshank I. Being that he was a pharaoh of Egypt, we have lots of contemporary extra-biblical sources for him. Okay, so the goal of this video is to see if we can get a verification checkmark for anyone even earlier than Shawshank, and in particular, someone on the Bronze Age side of this big blue line. So let's start with who I think is the best possible candidate for making this happen. He's not actually shown on this family tree chart, but if he was, he'd be placed somewhere here as a contemporary of Moses. I'll let Dr. Andrew Mark Henry from Religion for Breakfast explain more.
Balaam son of Beor is one of the more mysterious figures in the Bible, a non-Israelite prophet who does the bidding of the God of Israel, only to be later cast as a villain and killed by the Israelites. He appears in the book of Numbers chapter 22. The Israelites are nearing the end of their 40-year wander through the wilderness after escaping from Egypt, and they're camped on the plains of Moab, just northeast of the Dead Sea and modern-day Jordan. And the Moabites are understandably alarmed. The Israelites have just destroyed a few of their neighbors, and the Moabites are afraid that they're next. So the king of Moab decides to hire Balaam, who was famous for his very effective blessings and curses. Maybe with some supernatural help, with Balaam cursing the Israelites, the Moabites can properly defend themselves. While Balaam journeys to Moab, Moab on a donkey, God grows angry with him and sends an angel to block his path. The donkey can see the angel, Balaam can't, and while Balaam is striking the donkey trying to get it to move, the donkey starts talking and is like, hey, why are you doing this to me? Finally, Balaam sees the angel of the Lord who says, you can go to the Moabites, but speak only what I tell you to speak. And so when Balaam arrives, instead of cursing the Israelites, he blesses them in a series of 4 poetic oracles. Now, up until the 1960s, that's basically all we knew about Balaam, along with a few other passing references in the Bible. But in 1967, archaeologists discovered an inscription on a few pieces of plaster at an archaeological site called Deir Allah. The Deir Allah inscription dates to around 800 BCE, and it's written in a Canaanite dialect with some similarities with Aramaic. It starts, "This is the book of Balaam, son of Beor, a seer of the gods. The gods came to him at night, and he beheld a vision in accordance with El's utterance." So here we have an extra biblical reference to a seer named Balaam. Critical scholars agree that this is referencing the same character that we see in Numbers. The text describes the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon, El, coming to him with a message of disaster. The gods have banded together. The Shaddai gods have established a council, and they have said to the god of Shagar, "Sew up, close up the heavens with a dense cloud. That darkness exists there, not brilliance." So Balaam learns of a plan from the Shaddai, some sort of divine council of gods who oppose the chief god El, and they're planning to blanket the land in darkness. The text, as you can see, is very fragmentary, but it seems that Balaam successfully averts the Shaddai's plan. The story in Numbers and the Deir Allah inscription demonstrate that Balaam was a known character in the region east of the Jordan River. Now, some scholars think he was a historical figure, some sort of wandering prophet for hire, but at the very least, this is evidence of a shared tradition in the region about a heavily mythologized celebrity prophet. When we compare this inscription with the Book of Numbers, we can see how Israelite religion was embedded in the local cultural context and has affinities with other religious traditions in the region. In the Deir Allah inscription, Balaam is a prophet for the chief god El, and in several instances in his oracles in the Book of Numbers, he refers to the God of Israel as El. We see something similar with the Council of Gods in the Deir Allah inscription called the Shaddai. Shaddai is a plural form of the word Shaddai, which appears in Balaam's oracles referencing the Israelite God, the oracle of Balaam who hears the words of El, who sees the vision of the Shaddai, usually translated as God and the Almighty respectively. And narratively speaking, scholars have pointed out similarities between the story in Numbers and the inscription. Both include poetic oracles, and both include the plot point of having a vision at night that's then reported the next morning. Scholars argue that this means the story in Numbers knows what a Balaam story should sound like. In other words, if Balaam is a stock character in the local folklore, then it would have been a literary convention to include a nocturnal vision. So scholars generally agree that the Deir Allah inscription and at least parts of the story in Numbers derive from the same cultural context, though repackaged for different audiences. Now, none of this proves the historicity of the story in Numbers. The Deir Allah inscription dates to the Iron Age, around 800 BCE. The Book of Numbers describes a narrative that claims to be situated in the Late Bronze Age, maybe around the 15th century BCE. But Numbers itself, the book, was composed centuries later, also during the Iron Age. So we're talking a span of hundreds of years between the supposed events of Numbers 22 and the date of composition of both the Deir Allah inscription and Numbers 22. It's more likely that both of these texts are drawing on a local tradition about Balaam that was circulating east of the Jordan River in the 9th to 7th centuries BCE. The story in Numbers also seems to reflect the political reality of the Iron Age, when the kingdom of Moab was a frequent rival of the Israelite kingdoms.
So, as Dr. Henry explained, it is possible that Balaam was in fact a real historical person. However, the extra-biblical source we have for him comes from the Iron Age, not the Bronze Age. So in other words, it's not a contemporary source. Or it could be that Balaam actually lived in the Iron Age, and that the biblical authors simply placed him further back in time. Either way, we can't give Balaam the same kind of verification that we can give to Shawshank or Omri. Balaam's verification would be more at the level of David. Regardless, the Deir Allah inscription is an amazing find, and does at least open the possibility that the Bible contains a reference to a real Bronze Age person who was important enough in the region that his name was remembered centuries later. Let's now take a look at the most important biblical figure from the Bronze Age, Moses. Is there any evidence in the archaeological record of him? Well, there's one particular inscription that some argue does in fact mention Moses. I'm going to let PhD candidate Lachlan Davis from the up-and-coming YouTube channel Tablets and Temples tell you more.
This is the Sinai 361 inscription, one of several carved inscriptions discovered near an ancient mining site on the Sinai Peninsula. Bold claims have been made that these texts contain the name Moses, as well as descriptions of events from the Exodus, such as Moses performing miracles and creating a bronze serpent statue. The inscriptions date to the 2nd millennium BCE and are written in Proto-Sinaitic, the oldest known alphabetic script, from which the Phoenician and Paleo-Hebrew alphabet is descended. So are these writings evidence for Moses and the Exodus? One such advocate is Dr. Douglas Petrovich, who translates the inscription as follows. Our bound servitude has lingered. Moses then provoked astonishment. It is a year of astonishment because of the lady. Such a reading evokes images of slavery and miracles performed by Moses in the book of Exodus. Another translation by Professor Kramalkov reads, "This is the site of where stood the snake of bronze that Moshe, meaning Moses, Mahub Ba'alt made." He argues this is a reference to the bronze serpent Moses created in the book of Numbers. While these sensational claims are exciting, the reality is these translations have been heavily criticized, and the texts likely don't say Moses at all. The Hebrew name Moses comes from the Egyptian word Messi, meaning to give birth, and has S as its middle letter. However, translators who found Moses in the Sinai inscriptions have mistaken a letter for the Phoenician S sound, when it is actually a Sinaitic TH letter, as in thin. So if the word is a name, it's probably Mat, which means twin in Ugaritic. The scholar Dr. Aaron Wilson Wright has demonstrated that these sensational Moses translations rely on restoring words that aren't in the inscription and inventing new meanings for other words. So she proposes the following translation. O returner, those who tell people about Maat, a beloved of the lady. The lady is the Egyptian goddess Hathor. This is a common expression among the Sinai inscriptions. Another text, Sinai 351, reads, "Beloved of the lady are those who tell people about Maat, the miner and extractor." And still another, 349, calls Maat the chief of miners. It appears these inscriptions commemorate a mining official, possibly named Maat, and offer blessings from Hathor. The texts make no reference to Moses, snakes, or miracles, but they are a fascinating example of writing in the world's oldest alphabet, and scholars are continuing to work on deciphering them.
Okay, so maybe those inscriptions don't refer to Moses, but there's lots of other evidence for the Exodus, right? Well, no. In recent years, several popular documentaries have come out which claim to go through lots of evidence for the Exodus, but in each case, the evidence presented is extremely flimsy and has not been verified by any actual experts. So for this topic, I'm going to let a real archaeologist, Raven De Silva, from the channel Dig It with Raven, explain further. She has a new book coming out called The Other Ancient Civilizations, Decoding Archaeology's Less Celebrated Cultures, which I'll leave a link to in the description. Over to you, Raven.
2 stone pillars flank the Gulf of Aqaba in the Red Sea. Supposedly, they were erected by King Solomon to commemorate the crossing of the Red Sea by the Hebrews after they were freed by Moses. But are these pillars actual archaeological evidence of this biblical event? Let's get into it. In 1978, Ron Wyatt, an American nurse anesthetist and amateur archaeologist who claimed to have made over 100 biblical archaeological discoveries, found a red granite pillar at the Egyptian side of the Gulf at Nuweiba. According to his report, it was found on its side in the water itself, but today you can find it on the side of a road erected in concrete about 500 feet away from the beach. Wyatt said that there was supposedly an inscription, or there should have been an inscription, on this pillar that had since been eroded away, and he also said that it was of Hebrew or Phoenician origin and dated to around 3,000 years old. I tried to look at this pillar and date it off of the photos and biblical documentaries that are out there, but there aren't really many very detailed, high quality images of this pillar, so it's It's really difficult to do so. I can't tell you how old it is with any confidence, but looking at the design of this pillar, I don't know about you, but it looks very nondescript to me. That means it could be from anywhere or any time throughout history, to be honest, unless we get a closer look at it and do some actual scientific research on it. The pillar doesn't have a capital, so that also doesn't really help in its identification. And when I think of Phoenician pillar, I think of this. Ron Wyatt himself did not do any scientific studies on it from what I've seen, because there are no peer-reviewed papers out there to actually talk about any of his discoveries. So again, there's nothing firmly documenting it anywhere saying that it was from 3,000 years ago and it is of this design. In 1984, Wyatt claimed that he found a second pillar directly opposite Nuweiba on the opposite side of the Gulf in Saudi Arabia. It was apparently immediately removed by Saudi authorities, but it was apparently inscribed with the following words on it: Yahweh, Pharaoh, Mizraim, or Egypt, Moses, death, water, Solomon, and Edom. In what context? Wyatt didn't say. He also didn't mention any fragments of words or other words that maybe were, connecting words or sentence words. And he didn't mention like the placement of the words or what context. There's no rubbing of the words or any photographic evidence of the words. So it all just seems very convenient and keyword themed. It's almost like he was doing SEO for a pillar. There's that extra layer of convenience as well, because it was a mysterious pillar that was found and then it was swiftly taken away immediately, only to have like a plaque in Saudi Arabia marking where it was. And that's literally the only physical remains that we have, is this like little commemorative plaque on the other side of the Red Sea. If Wyatt had taken any sort of photos of the pillar, or again, inscriptions, anything like that, then we could maybe talk about its legitimacy and a little bit more of the dating and its connection to the one in Nuweiba. But until then, it's one of those things where the jury's out and you won't be able to convince me until I see some hard scientific evidence. I also quickly want to point out that King Solomon supposedly erected these pillars 400 years after the Red Sea crossing apparently happened. Even if he did erect these pillars, that doesn't actually mean that the crossing of the Red Sea happened. People erect religious monuments all the time, and if it was so long after it happened, it doesn't actually confirm that this event took place. What I do find interesting is that Ron and his sons found and photographed supposed coral-encrusted chariot pieces at the bottom of the Red Sea, as well as chariot wheels and bones belonging to both humans and horses. Apparently, some of the wood that they found had gold gilding on it, but it was too deteriorated and fragile to actually be removed from the water for any further scientific study. Images of these finds were shown to Dr. Nassif Muhammad Hassan, the director of Egyptian antiquities at the time, though whenever I Google his name, only biblical websites come up, But Dr. Hassan claimed that one of the wheels was from the 18th dynasty. Apparently, this is the only time that an 8-spoked wheel was used in ancient Egypt, which does include the reign of Ramesses II. I'm not an expert in Egyptian chariots, so I can't tell you how many spokes were used for the wheels throughout all of Egyptian history, but I can show you an image of Ramesses II in a chariot when he was fighting the Hittites. Overall, there's just a lot of speculation and looking at something that could fit and making a claim without any sort of scientific evidence to back you up. Also, I'm sorry, you can't look at this coral formation and immediately claim that it's an entire ancient set of chariot wheels still attached to its axle. All of the overlays on these bits of coral supposedly marking out all of the spokes on a wheel are just wild to me. I'm not an underwater archaeologist, but this just doesn't look right. It doesn't look right at all. Apparently, a human femur that Ron Wyatt found in the Red Sea was tested at Stockholm University, and it was determined that it came from a man about 165 to 170 centimeters tall. But from what I saw, there was no documentation stating actually how old it was. So again, it can just be a bone. It might have just been a bone that was in the sea from someone else at any other point in history. Contrary to some beliefs, archaeology is in fact a science, and we don't make any conclusions unless there is irrefutable evidence that has been checked multiple times by varying methods. So until there are proper archaeological tests, surveys, excavations, to me, the Pillar of Solomon will remain simply a pillar in my eyes, and all of the coral remains underneath the water will simply be a rich, biodiverse home for sea life.
So yeah, this all boils down to how archaeology actually works in the real world. You can't just say, oh, I found this thing, but oops, I didn't take photos, and now it's gone. Or I think these fuzzy photos kind of look like wheels, but no expert has ever seemed bothered to take a closer look at them, even though the government of Egypt makes lots of money off tourism and is usually more than willing to examine just about anything if they think it is legitimate. So the bottom line is, major discoveries are always reported in peer-reviewed journals so that other experts can chime in and either debate things or verify things. They are not announced via commercially made documentaries. This general principle can be applied to lots more ridiculous claims that biblical literalists make, such as that this structure in Turkey is Noah's Ark, or that this statue is Joseph, because it comes from around the right time and place, and the figure appears to be wearing a multicolored coat. But just because something seems to fit the biblical narrative, it doesn't automatically mean that it does. Okay, so when it comes to Moses and the Exodus story, there's currently no archaeological evidence that points to a person like the Bible describes, or an event like the Bible describes. Now, that doesn't mean that there was definitely no Moses-like person. Probably the story is based on something, but it's safe to assume that the biblical version of Moses and the Exodus is more literature than it is literal history. But what about the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? When it comes to them, there's a claim out there that goes far beyond just finding their names etched into stones. In this case, some people believe that we actually know their precise burial place. Muslims in particular believe that at this site in Hebron, known as the Cave of the Patriarchs, lay not only the actual bones of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but of Adam and Eve as well. I'll let the Useful Charts animator, Syawish Rehman, who also hosts the Islamic history channel Al-Muqaddimah, explain.
In 638 CE, the Holy Land came under the control of the youngest of the three Abrahamic religions, Islam. The Rashidun Caliphate, under Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab, conquered cities like Jerusalem, Gaza, and Hebron, which marked the transfer of the biblical holy sites, many of which are holy to Muslims, Jews, and Christians, to Muslims. While the Caliphate didn't persecute religious minorities and even protected many of their sacred sites, such as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, many other sites were converted to the Islamic tradition and made into mosques. Among these newly Islamized mosques was the Ibrahimi Mosque, which was previously a Byzantine-era basilica enclosed in a Herodian-era complex. This complex was built shortly before the birth of Jesus on top of a cave known as the Cave of the Patriarchs. It's called that because according to the traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this is where the patriarchs and their wives are buried. It's said that the patriarch Abraham, known as Ibrahim in Islam, bought this cave when his wife Sarah passed away. Then Abraham, his son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob were buried along with their wives Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah, respectively. According to some sources, Adam and Eve are buried there as well. The complex that we see today was built by King Herod the Great of Judea shortly before Jesus was born. However, Josephus, who wrote so much about Herod's construction projects, doesn't give him credit for the complex. In 2020, a paper was published that mentioned pottery found at the site from multiple cities that dated as far back as the 8th century BCE. This puts the site as a location that was visited by people maybe from all over the Holy Land as far back as during the days of the Kingdom of Judah. The Babylonian exile was still some 2 centuries in the future at this point. What we know as Judaism today, which is in fact Rabbinic Judaism, didn't exist in its current form at all. However, while the 8th century BCE is quite far back, it's still around 1,000 years after Abraham is supposed to have lived, which is around 1800 BCE or so. Now, according to the vast majority of academic scholars, Adam, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are purely mythological characters and did not, in fact, exist. Since they didn't exist, their burial sites didn't exist either. However, this didn't stop people from claiming to have found bones down there. During the Islamic era, it was forbidden to go into the caves below the complex as a form of respect for the patriarchs. However, there was a brief period of around a century, the 12th century to be precise, when the Holy Land was under Christian control, after the First Crusade. During this period, the caves were more accessible and a monk claimed to have found bones there. Although many sites around the world claim to be burial sites for various biblical and Quranic figures, there are even multiple places claiming to be the burial place of the same person. So the whole thing isn't very scientific.
Okay, so it's safe to say that the traceable activity at the Cave of the Patriarchs site goes no further back than the Iron Age, even though it supposedly contains the remains of people from the Bronze Age. So unless someone opens the tombs and tests the supposed bones in there, this site cannot be used as evidence for the existence of any biblical character. And the same goes for the plethora of other sites, most of which are Islamic, which claim to hold the bones of other biblical characters, such as Abel, Noah, and Moses. Okay, so I'm actually going to end this video on a positive note. That's because there is one particular figure from the Bronze Age, for whom we have lots of contemporary evidence for, that might actually be mentioned by name in the Bible. So this is not a central biblical character, but rather a foreign figure that is maybe mentioned in passing in the biblical text. In fact, it's a Bronze Age figure whose name is very well known, Hammurabi, king of Babylon. So obviously, for this last segment, I had to ask Assyriologist Dr. Joshua Bowen from the channel Digital Hammurabi for his thoughts.
In Genesis 14:1 we read, "Now in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tigal, king of Goyim." Who are these kings? Because Shinar is known to be another name for the land of Babylonia in the Hebrew Bible, this led scholars to look for a Babylonian king with whom to identify the first king, Amraphel. In the late 19th century, this king of Shinar was identified as Hammurabi, assuming that the Akkadian form of his name had been confused when brought into the Hebrew text. However, scholars later moved away from this view. A significant development came with the publication of 3 relatively late cuneiform texts that were likely copied from earlier texts during the early 1st millennium BCE, known as the Spartoli tablets. These texts describe 4 kings who fought against the city of Babylon. In the late 19th century, Pinchas, the scholar who published the tablets, read the name of one of the kings as Kedor-Laomer or Kedor-Laomer, and made a connection between this name and the Kedor-Laomer of Genesis 14. This led to scholars looking at the names of the other kings in the Spartoli tablets to see if they could make other connections to those in Genesis 14. In the tablets, the king of Babylonia was named Ibiltutu, and it was argued that this name referred to the Babylonian usurper Marduk-apla-iddina. The name Marduk is written in Sumerian Amar-Utu, and it was theorized that the writer of the biblical texts had at his disposal a shortened form of Marduk-apla-iddina's name, which consisted of the Amar of Amar-Utu and Apal, thus Amar-Apal, which found its way into the Hebrew text as Amraphel. Recently, in a monograph about the history of the city of Babylon, Stephanie Daly presented the current opinions on this passage in an appendix entitled Genesis 14, 1-16, and possible links with foreign rulers early in the reign of Hammurabi. There she notes that, although scholars abandoned the early notion that Genesis 14 referred to kings from the time of Hammurabi, this has again come back to be a tenable position. About the name Amraphel, she writes, either Hammurabi with an unexplained suffix el, or Amud-Pi-el, king of Katna, with the common misreading of the letter R for D, possibly a confusion of the two names. Although research in the last 2 decades, particularly from material from the time of Hammurabi at the city of Mari, has moved scholars back toward identifying the Genesis 14 names, including Amraphel, king of Shinar, with kings from the time of Hammurabi, it would appear that we still do not possess enough information to draw definitive conclusions.
Okay, so that's a maybe, and a very interesting one at that. If the Amraphel mentioned in Genesis 14 is in fact a reference to the great king Hammurabi of Babylon, then that means that Hammurabi is the oldest known historical figure mentioned by name in the Bible. And it also means that we have verification for at least one Bronze Age person. Now, it actually makes sense that Hammurabi's name in particular might have found its way into the Bible. According to critical scholars, Genesis 14 was most likely written during the Babylonian captivity, which took place following 586 BCE. Being that Hammurabi was one of the most famous Babylonian kings of all time, it's not hard to believe that the Judahite scribes living in Babylon during the 500s might have heard about him and might have decided to work him into their nation's origin story. So the conclusion is still that there is a huge difference when it comes to the Bronze Age parts of the Bible and the Iron Age parts. The names of the main characters from the Iron Age section are relatively easy to find in the archaeological record, whereas the names of the main characters from the Bronze Age section are not. Likewise, the Iron Age parts contain lots of references to foreign individuals who are known to be real historical people, whereas the Bronze Age parts have at best just 2 references. Okay, so that was a look at the Bible and the Bronze Age. Special thanks to all my fellow YouTubers who helped with this video. I've placed links to all of their channels in the description. So if you're looking for some new channels to subscribe to, I suggest you check them out. Thanks for watching.